Hi, my name is Sherelle, and I chose to present CSS, Cascade, and Inheritance. The first thing I want to introduce is a quote from Elder Bednar. Ordinary people who consistently do small and simple things that are right before God will bring forth extraordinary results. The principles that I'm going to go through are pretty simple, but as your coding gets more and more complicated, you will bring forth extraordinary results as you consistently adopt these principles and understanding. I want to first just highlight something very basic, but just a couple key terms. So in this declaration, we need to remember that the selector in this case is the H1, which points to the HTML element. And the property in this is the color and the font size. And the value, for example, is blue and 12 pixels. But let's talk about a problem, something that you've probably come across quite a bit so far. How many of us have found that we're using our CSS and we think it should be applied to one element, but it's not working? Why is that happening? What factors determine the rules that apply to CSS, specificity, and inheritance? Style sheets cascade means the order of the CSS really matters. For example, the last rule used is always the most important, except when it's not, but we're just going to talk about the last rule used. So, for example, in this case, we have two declarations. The first one styles the color with the value of blue, and the second declaration also styles the H1 with the color of red. Well, in this situation, because the most recent color is red, the heading is going to be red. But let's talk about specificity. Specificity is how the browser decides which rule applies and if there are multiple rules for the same element. There are a hierarchy of rules. So it's important to understand which things are most important. For example, a class selector is going to trump an element selector. Let me give you an example. In this style, there's been a class assigned with the color to the value of purple. Below, we see that the H1 has also been styled with the color to the property of red. Even though in this case, the H1 selector comes after the class selector, due to its specificity, is more important than the H1 selector. So, for example, in this heading, the heading will not be red. That will be purple. Another thing we need to concern ourselves with is inheritance. Inheritance is parents and children. And just like in real life, some values are inherited by their children, or in this case, child elements, but some aren't. For example, in this example where we have a body that is styled to the color of blue, all of the children, including the paragraphs, will be styled blue. But we also have a specific style with the value of red for a span. So in this case, even though the body is set to blue and inherited through all its descendants, both paragraphs, as you can see here, the color will be blue but the color is changed when the span element is styled to the color red. And you can see here the span in red. So what inherits? Widths, margins, padding, borders do not inherit. I am told that as time goes on, a lot of inheritances, it's just going to become common sense. That may not feel so accurate now, but as time goes on and we understand various roles that inheritance has, this will become easier and easier to control and understand. A few values that we can use to control inheritance is default, inherit, initial, revert, and unset. Default uses the browser's default stylings. So for example, if a body is styled to the color of red, all of its children will inherit the color red, including the paragraphs. But in this case, where the linking attribute is blue, it is because the default browser uses the color blue for the linking attribute. Inherit turns on inheritance. So for example, in a similar example where the body is styled to the color red, a class attribute on a linking, a class on a linking attribute can style the color with the value inherit. In this case, the linking attribute inherits the color red from the body. Initial sets the property value to initial value. So in this case, once again, when the body is styled to the color red and a class is given to the linking attribute with the value initial, the color is changed to the initial color, and in this case, in this example, the linking color is black. Unset resets the property to the natural value or inherited value. Once again, in this example where a body is styled to the color red and a class attribute is given with the value unset, the linking attribute is styled back to the color red because it is the natural inherited or initial value. Revert. Revert reverts the property to the browser's default styling. So once again, in this similar example where the body is styled to the color red and a class is given to the linking attribute with the value of revert, the linking attribute is once again blue because it reverts back to the browser's default styling. So how do cascading style sheets, specificity, and inheritance work together? Well, it's important to really understand the cascade. First, we need to know source order. If the rules have the same weight, the last rule is applied. Specificity. If an earlier rule is used that conflicts with the later rule, it's because it has a higher ranking. More on this in the next couple slides. Specificity ranking will determine what rules are used. Also, we need to note importance. There is a hierarchy of importance for CSS rules. Using the declaration important to make the property and value the most specific thing, it will override all of the other CSS rules. We're going to talk about selector specificity measurements. But first, I want to remind you in this declaration what the selector is. And in this case, you can see that it is the H1. But what things are measured in a selector to rank the specificity higher? So thousands, hundreds, tens, and ones are awarded for various things. Thousands are awarded to selector declarations inside a style attribute, or in other words, inline styles. Hundreds are awarded to selectors for each ID selector contained in the overall selector. Tens are scored for each class selector, attribute selector, pseudo-class contained inside the overall selector. Ones. Selectors score a 1 for each element in the selector. I will add a link when I post this for more information about how selector specificity measurements are given and awarded and measured.